Hi, everyone. I'm Elena Park. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 9th and final New Works Composer Sessions. I've tuned into some of them, and I know that the composers who are part of the program have benefited from a real interesting range of things, from the very grounded about legal issues, sync licenses, and other things that are very practical things that composers need to know, especially these days, to experimental artists like Pamela Z. And today we have, for the final session, a session with somebody who is really a thinker, a dreamer. Karen Wong moves freely between art, design, technology through her work at the New Museum and the Festival New Ink, and her pioneering Onx studio, ONX, I'm not sure which way it's said. I think that it's fitting that Karen is going to talk to the composers today, whether the composers want to do more classically oriented work or whether they want to explode the form, because of course, National Sawdust is a place for incubation and to catalyze ideas. And Karen Wong is known as someone who is anti-disciplinary because she doesn't necessarily want to adhere to things that limit creativity and the imagination. So with that, I want to turn the program over to Karen Wong.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you so much for welcome and hosting today. Just at the top of this, I want to stress that I am not a musician. I'm not really an expert in anything, but I do love architecture. I do love music. And what I hope today is, talk about how architectural language can inform the creative practices for composers, for musicians. So before I begin a very quick lecture, could all the composers get a blank piece of paper and draw 12 squares on your piece of paper? So while you're doing that, I'm going to screen share and kick off with the talk today called The Shape of Sound. And I'm going to begin with the concert hall. So this is the Odeon of Herodes Atticus in Athens, built in 161 AD. It's originally a steep slope theater. There's a 3-story stone front wall, and it's a venue for music concerts with a capacity of 5,000. I think in ancient times, Odeons were built for musical contests. And of course, in the last 20 years, this beautiful amphitheater in Athens was remodeled and is in use today. Now I jump many years ahead to 1776. This is La Scala, Teatro alla Scala, which is theater at the stairway. It, of course, is in Milan. It's one of the most renowned opera houses. It's replaced an earlier theater that had been burned in 1872. It actually became the property of the city of Milan. And like so many other theaters of its time, it was also a casino. So this notion of hybridity is not new to the 21st century. And then just a fun fact, the boxes were rented to nobles who could decorate them with their own furnishings. So I love this idea of blurring formal space with domesticity. And then here I show you a collection of concert halls built in the last 20 years. The exception, of course, is the Philharmonic in Berlin, all centered around this idea of the vineyard hall. It's the style of design for a concert hall where the seating surrounds the stage, rising up in series of rows and mannered like the sloping terraces of a vineyard. And I simply just want to say here, as you look at these amazing spectacle concert hall pictures, that we really haven't gone that far in concert design. So over 2,000 years, we pretty much have the same template. It's a stage, it's in the front, and then there is seating around that stage. So my first kind of concept that I want to talk through is dismantling the stage. In this image, you see the Stockhausen presentation at the Park Armory of Octophony, which is this electronic masterpiece. Here we are in the Park Armory. It's 80-foot high space. It's the size of a football field. And we were asked to take off our shoes and put on these white cloaks and move around to this platform where we became 375 ghosts. So it was a white felt covered floor. And again, we had these matching back supports. We faced inward to a sound projectionist. And so what I'm trying to discuss here really is this idea of the dissolve of the stage, right? What we have here is the stage and the seating. It's in one realm, and it's literally this idea symbolized in this circle that we are unified. In this case, we have David Lang's Whisper Opera. This was a 65-minute piece where he wanted to write something that was so quiet and personal, the audience would need to be right next to the performers to hear anything at all. For me, I'm quite curious about this idea of the inversion, right? Here, typically, at most musicals, the musicians are in the pit, and now it's the audience. So you have this shifting power dynamic. I did go see this performance, and for me, to be quite honest, it was a bit convoluted, but certainly I was very excited by this notion of being inserted into the stage. And then Here Lies Love. It's a musical centered on the First Lady of Philippines, Imelda Marcos. It's an innovative collaboration by David Byrne and Fatboy Slim. The show was staged in a club setting with the audiences, standing on the stage floor while actors performed on the movable platforms. Hopefully many of you saw it at the Public Theater. It then moved to the Royal National Theater and then subsequently at the Seattle Repertoire. And in this case, it's integration, right? Where the audience members are really part of the cast, albeit we're all extras, but it's a very different notion of engagement compared to the concert hall. And then, of course, what can we say here, which is Kanye West. This is the St. Pablo Tour. This is, of course, a platform, a stage that has now risen 15 feet above the audience. It's surprisingly small. It's only about 20 feet long and 16 feet wide. But he's such a master of creating these iconic images where here he is in the shadow above the audience in a kind of demigod-like way. And then there are these spotlights on the concert goers. And here, what I'm so fascinated by is that we as the audience become this active organism. We're like a hive, we're moving with the stage, we're reaching up to the stage, we're fully aware of each other because of the way we're lit. Possibly we're making new friends. So just this notion of the stage becoming this magic flying carpet is incredibly original and something that one could speak about the symbolism for days on end. The second theme I wanted to review is orchestrating public space. In this case, I wanted to share with you an artist, Bruce Davenport, Dapper Bruce, who is a native in New Orleans. He's an outsider artist. And what I had to do here was take actually one very big vertical drawing, and I've just split it into two, but just to share this idea of how he is mapping out the way spectators and the marching bands of New Orleans organize themselves. It's almost like he's a drone above the action. And I just love how we can see as a almost floor plan what this looks like on the street, because this idea of how parades literally take over our streets all the time is this idea of orchestrating public space. In this case, we have the second line parades in New Orleans, and this is slightly different because as these musicians move through the street, we as spectators are asked to participate. They'll pass out other instruments. We're clapping, we're singing, we're moving along with them. So we very much become part of the action. We are agents and actors in this work. We go back to David Lang again, and in this case, he's partnered with Diller Scofidio Renfro, the very well-known architects of the High Line. And I think many of you know this piece, the Mile Long Opera. It was a huge project, 1,000 singers across from New York, happened over 5 days. It was free to the public. It was this very ambitious choral work. As Liz Diller said, that the park will be a 30-block long urban stage for an immersive performance in which the audience will be mobile, the performers will be distributed, the city will be both protagonist and backdrop for a collective experience celebrating our diversity. I'm particularly interested in how they reverse this idea of a parade, which is oftentimes it's the musicians who are marching. In this case, it was us as an audience who we were the ones walking for a mile along the High Line while the musicians remained stationary. So really the flip of what a parade is. And then here to America, this was a musical walking tour at the Greenwood Cemetery, a very famous cemetery in Brooklyn. And it was inspired by what is commonly referred to as the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, written and set to music by the brothers, James Weldon Johnson and Jay Rosamond Johnson. There have been very few opportunities to perform live, obviously in the last 6 months. And so this was a fascinating way to take small groups on a 2.5-hour journey, primarily outside, where you would amble through the cemetery, which is gorgeous like a park, and come upon 6 groups of musicians. It's an evening that was riffing off anthem, race, and history. And again, so very much around this idea of circulation. And then finally, disembodied sound. The first work I'm noting here is Janet Cardiff's and George Barris Miller's Forest. What's so utterly captivating about this installation is how it's blurring the idea of this actual site and the art. There are 30 speakers embedded into these kind of log seats. And some of the sound is what you hear naturally in the forest. And then some of it is the mediated sounds that Cardiff has orchestrated. And so in one case, it sounds like there is an uprising happening, that there's horses trampling. And so there's a combination of anticipation and fear. And yet at the same time, that that isn't actually happening. But it's quite an exquisite work. Heron Mirza has been doing these artworks for the last 20 years. They're quite outstanding. This comes from his solar symphonies. This is Stone Circle. He's of course riffing off the idea of some of our prehistoric monuments such as Stonehenge. And in this case, what he's done is he's embedded speakers and LED lights into stones, with one stone having a solar panel, and it charges up, the electronics in this work. And at every full moon, the piece actually plays. So it actually only plays once a month. And then I think many of you are familiar with this piece, Janet Cardiff, the 40-part motet. Again, these are 40 speakers arranged in an oval, which is playing the famous piece Hope in Any Other by Thomas Tallis from 1556. Each speaker, as we know, represents a voice. And so essentially your body literally becomes the mixing tool, right? As you move around, you hear different things, you hear the way it's being distributed is different for each person experiencing this. And in some cases, people will come to this and they're crying. In other cases, people find it really creepy because the room is full of almost robot-like speakers. They're a proxy for absent singers. And one could say live singers are being replaced by technology. So there is this tension with regards to live and recorded, disembodied, embodied. So just one of these spectacular works that makes us really think. And then finally, one more work by Haroon, which again is looking at this idea of speakers and technology replacing singers in this quite complicated presentation around the idea of UFOs. So where we're at now is, what is the shape of sound? It's space, be it the concert hall, the street, the forest. Its bodies, are they passive, as in the traditional audience? Are they active and agents and actors in your work? And then these bodies, are they still? Are they circulating? Are they moving in a linear fashion on the High Line, or are they ambling through a cemetery? And so in this diagram, I'm really looking at the relationship of musician to audience. And so I made these quick diagrams only to look at this idea of amplification. When you're doing an opera or a classical or a pop concert, it's one directional. The music is being amplified to the audience, and it's very similar to a musician having now broadcast to a screen, to a camera where there is no audience. In this case, the disco jazz diagram, I think when you have a DJ or when you have jazz musicians, their music can pivot. It can change based on that audience reaction. And certainly it's, you know, similar to the disembodied performance. It depends who you go with. Did you go by yourself? How did you guys react to those speakers? Did you do it together? Did you not? And then finally, in gospel music, certainly music of the church, there's this much more kind of binary relationship where musician to audience, it's a call and response. And then I also think about the idea of the rapper battle, and particularly what Swiss Beats did with Timbaland during the pandemic, which was to create these versus battles. I'm thinking Erykah Badu and Jill Scott. So depending what songs Erykah played, Jill would respond in a different way. So this, again, this idea where things get very messy, the shared experience, while at the top, those types of diagrams is really more a polite experience. It's the same experience. So my prompt would be, if you're a polite composer, get messy. And if you're messy, get polite. Let's get out of our comfort zones. Going back a little bit to architecture, I wanted to talk about 1922, which was when we started building skyscrapers. And one of the ways to soothe passengers of the new experience of riding an elevator was developers were piping music into this space to make the ride less scary. And then, of course, you know, we quickly go to this idea of Muzak, which is the brand of background music in retail stores and other public establishments. It came into being around 1934. It's been around, and it's an iconic name for years. And it was quite interesting in the 40s and 50s, buffeted by research. They said that music had a physiological influence on behavior, and they started creating this music called stimulus progression, which allowed companies to make their workers more productive. This is a very famous image. It's probably a Gen X movie, 1980, the comedy and musical Blues Brother with a young Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi in their prime. If you recall, they're moving up the elevator in the City Hall in Chicago, and as they ride up, they've got this, you know, orchestrated version of The Girl from Ipanema, and it's just a hilarious kind of digression from what's going on around them, which is they're being chased by hundreds of police officers. So now if everybody will take out their piece of paper with their 12 squares, we have a hypothetical assignment. So here's the deal. National Sawdust has secured 20 skyscrapers in New York City, and we're going to get to take over their elevator banks. We call this campaign Buildings Make Music, and each of you is assigned to a location. Those 12 squares you drew are your elevators. And please take the next 4 to 5 minutes to conceptualize how you might compose or present music in this diagram. You have a captive audience, yet it's for a short time. The ride is up and down. What happens when you stop at certain floors? What happens if I ride all 12 elevators? And as you are completing this exercise for the next 4 minutes, we will have a little bit of background music. Great, let's stop there, pencils down. And so essentially, I was just really excited to have everybody start to not be so attached to prescribed spaces of where we think music should be performed or how we compose music oftentimes for these grand spaces. So, what happens when we can take over all kinds of different types of architecture around the city? I think I have 2 volunteers who will share with us how they approach the exercise. So if I may call upon Tanya Radzwa to share with us how you took a look at this assignment. Yay, Tanya Radzwa.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I had fun. Well, first thing with my 12 squares is they weren't very spread out and linear. They were different sizes. So I like color pens. And so I felt like these were kind of like squares and these are bigger. Then I started to think like, oh my gosh, does this count as one square? And I thought about like those square games you see sometimes where it's like, how many squares do you see? And this is 1 and this is 2, 3, 4, So that was something. But for the elevator project, one of the ideas that I jotted down was this idea of disrupting elevator etiquette. So close quarters, which is probably going to be terrifying post-COVID-19, I'm not going to lie. But so thinking about, how when you enter an elevator, people tend to naturally space like atoms and just find, optimal distance. So what happens if you kind of have bodies or performers who are in there intentionally disrupting elevator expectations through movement and maybe, a little bit of acting. I'm an actor too. So do we come in and pretend that we're having an argument? Like it's close quarters and it's artificial intimacy for the duration of the ride. So how far can we take that? I also thought about one of the things I thought about was whether the elevators were opaque or transparent. When you go in a hotel and sometimes it's transparent, and I wondered what could we see, beyond just that rectangle? What if there was much more to see and how to play with that visual space? And then specifically in terms of sound, one of the last thoughts I had, I guess, was thinking about intimacy is what's on my mind, feeding in sound from other elevators so you can hear what's happening in all the other 11 if you're in one. Right. So nothing is really private. So that's what I got up. That's what I was playing with.
I love all that. The idea of inserting, these bite-sized dramas in a, 20-second ride, I find that quite perverse yet thrilling.
I also like the fact that all of your elevators were not the same size, because you might have an intro piece and then you might have a longer spell.
Yeah.
I think it's great that you didn't assume that the box is the same size for everything. When you were talking about forced intimacy, it reminded me of a theater piece where there was a woman in a bathtub and you were in a very small space, and that was a theater piece. And at first I thought, that is the worst idea I've ever heard. And then I was like, that is a fantastic idea. And everyone probably would be a little uncomfortable. And then it was playing with the gaze.
Yeah.
On a particular body. But I love the fact that you were thinking of like captivity, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always think about, the subway, a crowded subway, and how we have public transportation is the weirdest, most intimate space when it's crowded. And so that's what I was kind of thinking about in the elevator is, we try so hard to act like we're total strangers in this very close space. And there's something very interesting about how committed we are to acting like we're not in a space together with headphones or da-da-da. So what would happen if, just kind of broke that instinct, it just broke it open.
I would love to now call on another composer who volunteered, and that's Mario. So if Mario can join.
Hey!
Hi.
How's everyone doing?
Really well. Thank you for
That's good.
volunteering.
Oh, of course. I'm up here. The internet might be bad. I'm in Maine.
Okay. All good. Tell us what you got. Tell us what you got.
All right. So I have a couple squares here. You see these squares?
Yes.
Oh, you can see it. So basically, I did not, I don't, I want like a merry-go-round. Let's think of a merry-go-round, right? So the elevators change every single time, you see? So you don't get the same elevator every time. You don't get like, you don't want the first one first every time. It's boring every single time. So we got the first elevator, well, I came up with, is a hologram of Geordi from Star Trek. You know that guy, Geordi from Star Trek? And bossa nova music. It's just happening. It's just like chich ginky gink gink gink, and then Jordy's standing there right next to you, right? You
Yes.
know, and then two to three elevators of absolute silence. You see, absolute silence, and then a 10-minute elevator of a like a, let's think of like a Sarah, no, not Sarah Palmer, Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks, screaming 10 minutes, 10 minutes, really, really loud, extremely loud. The next one is a man and woman. You see it. There's another, like, there's a video screen, and you see the, and you hear it more. It's very loud, and you hear a man and woman ordering and eating a pastrami sandwich. You see, and there's doo-wop happening. This is true. This is true. Also, and then another one of like just a congested. It's like a congested experience. Each one of them, you know. And I have I'm yelling. I have my headphones on. I'm sorry. But yes, I'm just coming up with, and so, and then like another elevator, just heavy breathing elevator, you know. And each elevator is different, and they all what was it called, they all fit together in an odd way, and the experience is that they, you know, you go in it, you could go in it again, but it changes each time because people are doing this live. You know, it could not even be recorded. You know, people could be doing this live in another room there.
So I love this metaphor of the merry-go-round, but also this notion of episodic. I think so much of the way we're reframing and contextualizing content is in episodes, meaning that we need to break things down. In many ways, it's bite-sized so that it's digestible. But I think certainly the idea that if you were to have these multiple elevators, you could do something that magnified this idea of what is an episode.
But I also wonder if all the elevators could be different. Everyone's telling me I'm in the house with people. They're saying I'm yelling. Apparently, I'm yelling.
You sound very excited. It's fine.
No, it's with, I have the headphones on. So I wonder if each elevator is also, you know, there are the art elevators. You know, at the Whitney Museum, there are the huge elevators. We
Yes.
could decorate each one, you know, we could make it seem like the holograms could be real feeling, you know, and, you know, anyway, that's all.
Great. Thank you so much, Mario.
Well,
Oh,
yes,
and
yes.
Mario, in your
Yes, yes.
fantasy, would people come over and over and over again?
Would they come?
experience it?
No, the last elevator, they're killed by a serial killer.
Oh, okay. Well, we won't advertise that part because you want people to experience your work.
No, I know.
Before you go, I just want to say Karen and I were talking yesterday about this piece that Yuval Sharon did in LA called Hopscotch. And it was the deconstructed myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And you were driven around in limousines. And there were three or four different routes. And you would just go on one route and you'd experience little episodes out of time of the story. But I think that it picks up on a lot of the things that you were saying, because there was a randomness to it. You couldn't do a through line narrative. One was constantly either moving in a car or walking through a building or down the street. And there was an unexpected quality to it that I think kind of got you very far out of what you usually think when you're receiving a piece of theater or music, which was exciting.
Yeah, you need to have unexpected things or it's going to be boring.
Do you think that is if there are people in this collective of composers or friends who are very happy to do a symphony or a chamber piece or an opera where you come and you sit politely, as Karen would say, in your seat and you receive it. What is your feeling about that? Or do you have any like intellectual tussles with people who—
Wait, what do you mean? Can you explain
like
that better?
Like if they want to sit deeply sit in a concert hall, buy a ticket, performance on the stage, and you receive it politely, and then the thing is over and you clap and you leave. Does that speak to you at all as a composer? Is that something you're interested in doing?
I think what my aesthetic is to do, I like everything. Like I think everything has its place. I don't think if that concert, like if there's a concert that, doesn't need seats and you have seats and you clap afterwards, then it doesn't make any sense, but if the performance needs seats and you sit down, then it makes sense, right? So
Mhm.
I think it just matters like what you're trying to show. It doesn't make, I don't think it's necessarily, I've gone to plenty of concerts that I've enjoyed. It doesn't matter even what I've done, but I think it just matters what is being presented,
Mm-hmm. So it comes out of the intention, like your artistic intention, and then the circumstances under which it should be performed or
yeah.
received.
And I think that's the hardest thing. And I know, like, from listening to a lot of the conversations over the last couple of weeks with the composers, a lot of composers ask questions kind of about grants and about money, where they get it. And the only thing that means is that people want to create what they want, and they need resources to do it. That's the only reason you need money to create art, and if you don't have enough of the money, then you can't create exactly what you want. You'll have to like compromise or something, and it won't be your vision. But obviously if there's an orchestral piece or something, or trio piece or like whatever, just something performed in a hall, and but it needs like you wouldn't sit down at a Michael Jackson concert, you stand at a Michael Jackson concert, or unless it's like a whatever. But that's just
Exciting.
Thank you, Mario.
Yep.
Karen, I see that Daniel, bye Mario, that Daniel, whose last name, if I tried to pronounce, I would not get it right on the first go, would love to participate and give a response to your exercise. So can we invite Daniel?
We have Daniel joining us. Hi, Daniel.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I think a lot about architecture when I'm writing, and a lot of my colleagues at Cornell are in the architecture department, and so I work with them a lot. When it comes to the exercise, I had two main thoughts when it came to your proposal here. One, if this is going to be an NYC, I thought it would be interesting to have 12 vignettes of everyday life within the city, separated by pumped-in music or music that is slowly shifting depending on the scene at hand. So I suppose that's more of like a standard approach, like just like my first thought. Second, the other idea that I had with the 12 floors was that the experience could be augmented by having the control be each floor has the same amount of time. So let's say it takes about 10 seconds for the door to open and for people to come and exit. And I was thinking that it would be interesting if each floor was a 10-second scene that was related through all 12 floors, adding up to about a 2-minute theater work. But the thing that is changing is the music and time between each of the floors. So even though we have the fixed time of each floor, the time between them is gradually becoming longer. And the subject matter of each becomes more and more serious, so the weight becomes also more. And then the music shifts from music to perhaps live performers are being piped in, or they are entering the elevator at different times. That's kind of the shifting perspective. So you have a fixed media and a changing media in perspective. And then the weight of each scene grows as well.
I love that. I love how you're taking the verticality and again, trying to also change up the experience of what our ride might be, but I think it's, still very possible. We've had just a whole range of crazy and poetic ideas. I think this exercise, I'm hoping actually to convince Paula that we actually need to do this, that we need to take over a bunch of skyscrapers in New York City and have you all compose for these buildings. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if Paula can make my dream come true.
Karen, when you were proposing this idea, you were talking about what might happen on different floors. And I know that you're not a composer, but what were you thinking?
I really am most interested in creating platforms, and for the folks who are experts at making content, and in this case, making music, I would let them, I let them do the art. So I had no prescribed ideas. I'm just excited that people approached the exercise in so many different ways. And really just as someone who is a fan of culture, I believe my skill set is try to create prompts and maybe open different doors to people, for people to enter and hopefully come out, in a different way.
In creating prompts, I know that you think this is a very inventive time, even though we're isolated and dealing with all of these things because of health and safety things. But it seems like from an interview I just read with you, that you're finding it to be a prompt to get people to think in different ways and to take back the streets and everything. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of this has to do, it's very specific to New York City, and it's very specific to outdoor dining. Here we thought that there could be this industry which could literally die before our eyes. All of a sudden we have outdoor dining. It's not the solve for everybody, but how creative people have gotten in terms of, quickly creating these pop-up scenarios, how chefs have had to change their menus so that the food in an outdoor setting can last longer. How we've also now become so accustomed to QR codes. I mean, QR codes were around 8 years ago and we wouldn't use them because we thought they were so stupid. They were so tacky. Oh, I'm not going to do that. And now QR codes are very much part of our everyday life, and I don't think it's going away. So all of these things were created in these quote unquote dire circumstances. All of this creativity has become so inspiring. You also think around the idea of the types of protests, the peaceful protests that have been going on in every city. And certainly protest art has been around for hundreds of years, in the form of posters and on facades of buildings. And how amazing now that people are using the actual street plane on the asphalt, creating these gorgeous chalk paintings that have really captured the imagination of visualizing what protests can stand for. So just the idea again of the street being this canvas for so many different kinds of artists, I think is a very exciting moment. Artists, activists, musicians. It makes me think of the project that I know you're very familiar with. I hope you could talk about the Angel project, which
Right.
you and I have discussed before, because again, that's really around this idea of how you make the city your concert hall.
Yeah, the Angel Project, which came to New York in 2003, it was by a director, Deborah Warner, who does theater and does opera. It was built on the city as a solitary experience. It was a theater piece where you would show up at a location at a time by yourself, and you'd commit to not speaking during the duration of this journey. You'd get this beautiful booklet because it was before the age of these. And it would instruct you on where to go and where to walk. And it started on Roosevelt Island, and you took the subway in isolation, and it was called the Angel Project. So you'd walk down the street and it would say, like, look up to your left and you'd see the hint of an angel wing. Or it would take you through to Times Square and there'd be a young nun just reading the Bible, standing as the city moved by her. most people thinking, what is that nun doing? But we're New Yorkers, so we just go right by her to get to our reservation or whatever we're doing. But what happened with this is that you were taken on a journey that was mapped out for you, but really loosely, because what they provided was part of your theater experience. And then whoever was walking by at that moment, whatever sounds in the cities were happening at that moment, became part of a kind of a dreamscape. And as a result, it's one of the most compelling things I've ever seen in my life. And Hopscotch takes part of that and moves it forward with music and limousines in LA, which is complicated. But it also took you into high rises, and you would go up an elevator. There was no music though. And then you would be out in a room, and there would be like white, just white. It looked like snow and, white lilies. And you'd walk through and there'd be another room with empty bird cages. But I think that there was a combination of treading ground that you knew well, but experiencing it in isolation and walking the course of the city that really was transformative. And I know that one of the things that you also believe is that we're moving away from spectacle into intimacy. And it was incredibly intimate. Now, over the course of this journey, you did see somebody that you realized was on the same journey, and you'd kind of nod at each other and you wouldn't talk because you had time slots, but you might linger in one place and then spend a lot of time in another place. But I think that these things, or the mile-long opera that you mentioned in your presentation, I think change fundamentally the way the artist, the composer, the theater maker, the performance piece creator thinks about space and our experience, and the artist and the audience member are actively involved in a dialogue that differs according to what that person brings to it and what's happening at that moment.
I mean, it's something that I think we've seen over the last decade. We will always have spectacle, we will always have festivalism, but I do believe that there is a strong sense from both us as participants, as audience, and with artists and musicians that we do want to engage with something that is more individualized, more around this idea that it's a shared experience. And so, and it's the reason why I'm so fascinated by the Angel Project is, on many ways, it's very simple. And I want everyone to understand that we don't have to reinvent anything. We don't have to create new architecture for new music. We can look at elevators, we can look at parking lots. And I also think around technology, let's look at what we have now. Audio guides are so prevalent in most cultural institutions, but they're didactic, they're educational. How can composers get their hands on audio guides and completely reinvent what an audio guide could be that is more around composition, more around soundscapes, more around things that could be theatrical? So I'm excited to see, our young leaders, our young cultural leaders grab at this material and develop some new art for us.
And I think what you're saying also is that the technology, if used in this way, would not create division or distance. It would actually bring you deeply into a story or into a musical experience.
Absolutely.
Just because you mentioned drive-ins, Karen and I were talking before about the Michigan Opera Theater drive-in experience of an hour-long version of Wagner's Götterdämmerung, that where people would drive in their cars and see scenes, and fabulous singers, Christine Goerke, Morris Robinson, obviously a piece built for this moment in time.
I know, I want to travel to Detroit to see that. I'm getting FOMO.
I know that there's so many things that, Karen, that I think that people are going to want to ask you, but I wanted to invite one of the composers, Baldwin Jiang, who is currently a doctoral candidate and fellow at the University of Chicago, and a composer whose music aims to empower communities of audiences and performers by creating concert experiences that are opportunities for collective wonder and judgment. I want to hear all about collective wonder and what that means. But you have a question for Karen, Baldwin?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really interesting. So I read in your bio that you also work with underserved Asian immigrant youth. And my question is, how have those experiences informed your ability to reimagine the spaces and boundaries that we continually cross in today's globalized and multimedia world? Have those experiences shaped your architectural language? And also thinking about class, a lot of immigrants are working class, or they represent a good part of the working class, whereas performance spaces are often marked as unwelcoming to the working class and part of hybrid culture. So yeah, thanks. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Great. I'm going to take your question backwards and just talk about where my architectural influence starts. I worked for 6 years with the Ghanaian architect David Adjaye in London. And so much of the way I think about architecture is certainly framed by his skill and talent. And oftentimes, in very subversive ways, he was always looking at the idea of how Blackness could be represented in his architecture. I remember that the very first house he ever built for two white artists, the facade was this eggplant brown color. It was very specific. And only years later, did I get the connection that that was the color of his skin. And so here he was, already marking in some ways his territory, his Blackness on the work. So that's a long way of.
Can you just mention how he came up with a design for the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
Sure. I mean, as folks know, that absolutely outstanding, gorgeous building, the facade of that museum comes from the Yoruba tribes, where he was looking at a lot of artifacts, particularly the way crowns were made. And so in this case, he used the pattern and created this stunning, metallic mirage, which changes with the light and is absolutely stunning no matter what time of the day you're looking at. But it quickly moves me, Baldwin, with regards to Apex for Youth, which is working with immigrant youth who certainly, as you say, don't have access to a lot of culture. I think one of the things that I certainly believe in is that as much of culture could and should be free. So that's one way for accessibility. But many of the things that I'm very much focused on is also making sure that our demographic actually sees each other in different cultural spheres. So, representation is something that is obviously lacking in many areas. And so I think both in my personal and professional ways of working, I'm always just trying to elevate those voices, particularly if, one is in a position of power. That's either putting people forward, it's writing stories about them. If I have talks, I'm often trying to make sure that I'm bringing on, someone who is of color or is a woman. So it's always just keeping those things top of mind, I believe, is how, that work has informed my own practice. I hope that answers most of your question.
Yes, thank you. That was great.
I had the opportunity to work with Kronos Quartet just recently at Stanford Live, and there was an idea, because the program was all about testimony and social justice and pieces, John Coltrane, Rhiannon Giddens, Charlton Singleton, but there was an idea to get poets from the Bay Area to share their original work. And through Youth Speaks, we were able to get a Sudanese American composer who was 17, a Taiwanese American composer who was 16, and 2 African American composers who are older, and an Indian American composer. And because the Kronos program was called Testimony, they all gave testimony of their stories or what they're thinking of in this moment. And it's great that when someone gives you the ability to curate a diversity of voices for their own sake. Anyway, it was an exciting project. But speaking of Taiwanese American, Michelle Chang she's going to ask a question for Karen. She's a 1.5 generation Taiwanese American, an interdisciplinary artist who uses music, experimental theater, and other forms of media to be in dialogue with social issues and cultural identities. You can start to join Michelle, and she has an interdisciplinary feminist improv collective, FFF or Triple F or Fortissimo, I don't know, and the experimental pop duet Neo-Arc. How do you say your collective name?
FFF.
FFF,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes. Hi, thank you, Karen and Elena. So my question is, I saw that you have been working, engaged in education with youth. So I was actually a public school educator and a program specialist at a children's museum. And those experiences really made me realize how bringing creative works to a broader community could be crucial in driving social change. So as you already know, I co-founded an interdisciplinary improv collective called FFF. So this is run by feminist media artists in the Silicon Valley. So we are relatively new, and we have been searching more ways to initiate community engaged performances. So I'm wondering if you could provide any insights on how an organization can engage and grow.
Well, that would probably take a whole, workshop. But I think what's really important to me, and the way I look at education is just really around shared experiences. One of my favorite things to do is often take friends whose kids are African American, Latino, Asian, and I do these gallery walks in New York City. I organize it, and I take a multi-culti group to walk around the Chelsea galleries, which tend to be very white spaces. So here we are, rolling up at these fancy galleries, because what I'm trying to ultimately say is that these are spaces that you should feel comfortable in. Let's come, let's hang out, let's take over. And, I give them a quick tour of the work. Oftentimes it's a work by an artist of color. So, we're making these connections immediately. And then we stick around and we have questions, and, love showing work to kids, because there's no fear. And it's the same thing with music. I love to take kids to musical concerts, because they'll just go right in there and they'll just tell you what they like, what they don't like. And I find that really exciting. And it's not the idea that I'm trying to teach anything. It's just simply I'm trying to show people what something that they're with. But I really think it's this idea where, spaces where traditionally we have not either felt comfortable or welcomed. This is the time to just go in and take over. We have this moment now. The tide is turning. The world is bending towards us. And we just have to, take this opportunity and make sure that the next generation of creatives have many more opportunities than I did, than you are having, So that's what I'm excited about.
Thank you.
Karen, to that point, that Kehinde Wiley statue that was in Times Square, I don't know if you saw it, Michelle, just blew my mind. So Kehinde Wiley created this, it took off from like a Confederate monument of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or whatever. And the pedestal was really, 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 really high. And it was a African-American guy with dreads on a horse,
Yes,
looking heroic and wearing some fabulous sneakers as well. And it wasn't a person, it was a composite. But when you saw it in Times Square, kind of owning Times Square and that public space, it just reset what you thought any of those things were. And then the thing got moved, and it's in Richmond.
yeah.
Richmond,
Yeah.
Yeah, Richmond, Virginia, at a time now when the Confederate statues in many places are being, taken down or stored somewhere, to just reflect this greater awareness of history.
No, I think that should be our next talk, which is monuments and music. I mean, I could go on about monuments as well. That's a whole nother session.
Well, you already have 2 sessions already that you have to do. I think we're coming onto time, but I feel like if there's a composer who has a burning question for Karen, now's your time. And I don't know how you moderate who gets to ask, but I'm leaving it to Charles and Eve to figure that out. Oh, okay, we can do it in the meet and greet. Okay, well, Karen Wong, clearly you have to have your own series, although I know you're super busy. I just want to say on behalf of Paolo Prestini and Eve and Charles, who are making everything work behind the scenes, to thank you for giving this beautiful and thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation.
And thank you for agreeing to be my partner in all of this. I really appreciate it.
Intimidated and delighted by the invitation.
Thank you, composers and musicians.
Okay, thank you.